Hello, I'm Janae Tibbs-Shirani and I'm here today with one of our double shot interviews here at interest.co.nz. And today I'm lucky enough to be joined by Shamubeel Eaqub, ahead of the release of his book Generation Rent, Rethinking New Zealand's Priorities, and that's being released this weekend. So Shamubeel has been busy working on this publication with his wife Selena, and has raised a number of exciting things which we're going to talk about today. So firstly, Shamubeel, the term or the phrase generation rent is a catchy one, and something that will, I suppose, no doubt be used quite a bit now. Can you just explain to us, you know, who are we talking about when we talk about generation rent, and how has this term come about?
Yeah, so, you know, when we've been looking at this issue of housing, the thing that became very apparent is that even though home ownership is a very important part of New Zealand culture, the reality is that most of the growth has been in renting, and it's becoming the reality of larger and larger number of people. And so rather than sort of focusing on an age group, what we have just thought about is this group of people who are forced into renting, even though it's very much a second-class option. And it's very much trying to give voice to this whole generations of people who have been left out of the Kiwi dream.
Sure. So, I mean, when we talk about housing unaffordability, there's so many different sort of solutions that we talk about when we try to address this issue, and you and Selena have raised a number of these in your book. The one that sort of stood out to me was, I suppose, the role of people who rent and the impact that they have on the economy and on the housing market. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So I guess, you know, quite often we talk about the housing market only in terms of purchasing houses, but we forget about the people who are renting. Now, so in New Zealand, about 50% of people over 15 rent. In Auckland, it's closer to 60%. So for very large parts of our population, they are actually renters. And what we don't have is a clear view in terms of what are their rights, what are their responsibilities, and the fact that they are very much active participants in our communities. And yet we treat them like they're people at the margins, and it's only really about people who own homes or people who invest in houses who have the biggest vested interest in this. And again, the idea of this book, the idea of the narrative around this book, and I think the narrative where we need to go is not just about what's happening with house prices and the consequences of that on economic stability and financial stability, but the much more important and insidious impact on social stability. And what we have sown are the seeds of inequality for future generations. Essentially, I see New Zealand going to a stage where, you know, there is this landed gentry. They own more and more of the housing assets, and the rest who get essentially into this this tokenism, this slavery of renting, even though renting is such a poor option.
So what do you think the government needs to do to get more people renting, which in turn I suppose might take some pressure off the demand for houses, for people who want to buy houses?
So we're not actively promoting that people should rent more, because there are lots of benefits in terms of cultural tie-in and all of those bits and pieces. The reality is that people can't own, they're forced to rent. It's not by choice. And what we would like to see is better solutions in the housing market to give people that choice rather than that forced renting. And I think there are two really big sort of themes of this. The first one is just making renting a better option. And to do that, I think we need to improve our renting rules. So, you know, the lack of security of tenure. I mean, you know what it's like. You know, it's like you're at the whim of your landlord. You can be kicked out any time. Very short notice periods for very little reason. All of those kinds of things. And we compare very unfavorably to countries like Switzerland or Germany, which have very high rates of renting, but people are happy to rent. And so that would be the first theme of solutions in terms of being able to fix the rental market. The second part is actually fixing the housing market. Fundamentally, I think in New Zealand, in our culture, ownership is really important. And we need to make ownership available to people if they want to. And to do that, we sort of proposed a whole bunch of solutions, but essentially the big ones are around, we have to fix the housing market in terms of the responsiveness of supply. So the land, the infrastructure, the capacity and capability of the building sector to build. These are really important. And the tax system, that's very much skewed in favor of investors. It's not implemented well. The banking system that favors lending for housing over entrepreneurship. These are all things that are very much geared towards the housing as an investment, housing in terms of ownership, but only available to few. So two big fixes in terms of fixing the rental market and in terms of fixing the supply of housing, which will eventually make housing more affordable.
Sure. And I mean, to talk about a little bit more about a few of those things that you just mentioned, big sort of stumbling block, one could argue, in Auckland are the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard, people who, don't want to see their lovely heritage homes go, and apartments being put up at key locations in Auckland that are in high demand. How do you think this issue should be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, there are no easy solutions, and every city struggles with this challenge. And we know that the vested interest of the current owners is that we want to preserve what we have. But for future generations, we also know that, for example, where we are now in Herne Bay, it cannot stay as 1 and 2 bedroom, 1 and 2 story houses. We have to get more density, we have to get more height, we have to get more capacity, because this land is extraordinarily valuable for people to be able to access work and play very easily. So, there are some of the solutions that have been proposed internationally are about how do we compensate people who are being affected by density rises around them. And these are things that are very much in play at the moment. We don't have good solutions, but those are the kinds of things that we think we need to explore.
Sure. And then I suppose another issue is foreigners buying property, and that is largely perceived as a major contributor to prices increasing. But in your book, you've said actually this is not the case, and the figures show this might not be the case. Could you explain this a little bit more to us?
So we've only got partial data on this, and based on that, we don't think they're very big, less than 10%. But the reality is we don't actually know. There is no good data that's available. And so one of the things that we suggested in the book is let's collect the data to make sure we understand how many foreigners there are in the housing market and what are they doing. And with the new rules that have been announced in the budget, we're going to go some way in doing that. And we are really interested in looking at that evidence and looking at the data. If it turns out that there are a problem, then we should have rules that help us resolve some of these challenges. But unless we know that it is a big issue, I don't think, I think it's a bit of a red herring. Because when we look at the data, whatever the foreigners are, the majority of purchasers are people who are investors with many properties. And we can understand why. House prices have risen so much. The only people who can buy houses are people who have benefited from the increase in house prices and have paid off the mortgages ages ago. So, it's very easy to point the finger at somebody else rather than look at ourselves and confront, I think, what are big challenges that we have created ourselves for our future generations.
Sure. So that, getting some better data collection or different methods will be quite key and a key first step.
Absolutely. I think the glare of transparency, it takes away, it's always tinged with racism, this kind of conversation. It's better to just go factual. This is the evidence, these are the number of people who are buying it, and this is how it works. And to be able to do it in that way, I think would be far more useful and far better, because then you'd have good policy that's responding to real problems rather than a perceived problem.
Sure. Right, and another one of these tools is capital gains tax, and this is another one that's received quite a bit of criticism and talk. Currently, my understanding is that you pay capital gains if you declare that you've bought the property with the intention of making a capital gain. But I've looked into this, it's pretty vague. There's lots of ways I believe you can get around this. How well is this law working, and what do you propose be done in this area?
Yeah, so New Zealand in effect already has a capital gains tax, and we saw that in the budget announcement when the government talked about that 2-year rule, in that if you've bought and sold within 2 years, you're deemed to be an investor and you have to pay a capital gain tax on it. And essentially what we have is a rule that's there, but it's very vague in its writing, very vague in its implementation, and it's not particularly effective. Now, just taking a step back, we don't think this is a solution in terms of fixing the housing market, but it just acts at the margin to take away some of that, I think, that speculative element that housing is a tax-free, highly geared, you can't lose kind of proposition. And what we proposed is not only do we have a capital gains tax, we ring-fence the investment properties, so you can't offset against your other income. That way, the housing investment stands on its own 2 legs in terms of its own cash flows, in terms of its own metrics, so that we would it would be unlikely, in my view, to see the kind of prices we're seeing now. Because if you see what's, the rents in most of the places around central Auckland, they simply do not cover the outgoings of those purchases.
Sure. All right. Okay. And just one more thing to touch on is the role of the Reserve Bank. And what role do you think the Reserve Bank has in this sort of crisis?
That's a really good question. And I think it's because we always looked at the Reserve Bank to do a lot. But I think they have two different mandates. And one is to manage the cycle, and the other one is to ensure financial stability. In terms of managing the cycle, we don't think that interest rates are the right tool in this environment. I'd be loath to see interest rates being raised to control the Auckland housing market when the rest of the economy is not doing so well. You look outside of Auckland, there is not much growth, house prices are not doing much, there is no inflation in the economy, there is absolutely no reason to raise interest rates. But at the same time, you can't cut rates because of the Auckland housing market, which is holding the rest of the economy hostage. So from a cyclical perspective, I don't think the Reserve Bank has a role in this. But from a financial stability perspective, I think the Reserve Bank has a big role to play and a very important role to play. We've already seen them come up with those new proposed policies around LVR restrictions for investors and the regionalization of their policy. This is new. Right? This is very much a policy innovation for the government. They have a Reserve Bank. They haven't done it before. We like it in the context that they're trying to address the specificity of the problem, which is the Auckland housing market. But we also know that when you make it very specific, problems pop up elsewhere. So what we propose is, instead of trying to sort of deal with this case-by-case basis, fix the fundamental issue that's leading to this huge amount of money piling into the housing market, which is the banking system. So in terms of the risk weights, which essentially say that you can lend more money to mortgages with less of your own capital than you could for entrepreneurship. And these rules are set internationally, but have been in place since the late 80s. And over that period, the amount of lending to mortgages has been increasing massively. In New Zealand, in the 70s, 60s, less than 10% of our bank lending was towards mortgages. Now it's over 50%. So banks are absolutely pushing more money into this. And I think that's the big area of policy focus for the Reserve Bank. We have to make sure that banks are not incentivized to lend even more money to mortgages at the cost of entrepreneurship. It's important that we build houses. It's important that we facilitate people moving and purchasing houses. But it's far more important to grow businesses that create jobs and long-term prosperity.
Sure. Right, well, Shamubeel, thank you so much for sharing some of these ideas with us and highlighting a few parts of your book. Some major cultural shifts and changes, I think, in which you're proposing are needed. So a lot of food for thought there. So I'm Janae Tibshirani and have been joined by Shamubeel Eaqub here on interest.co.nz.